A woman named Clara wrote to me last week, and I have been carrying her story with me every single day since. She said, I was 71 years old. I had given that man 40 years of my life, and when the will was read, his son handed me a hand-drawn map and said the swamp property was all I was getting. What was in that swamp, and what it did to every single person who dismissed her? I need you to hear this. Loyalty does not always get rewarded in the daylight. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it waits in a place no one would ever think to look. They kept the house on Birchwood Lane. They kept the accounts. They kept the 40 years of furniture and photographs and the life two people had built together from nothing. And they handed Clara Calloway a hand-drawn map to a parcel of swampland outside Harlan County, Kentucky, and told her that was her inheritance. His name was Douglas Merritt, estate attorney and son-in-law to the deceased, a man who wore his suits like armor and spoke to women over 65 the way some people speak to furniture. He looked at that map and thought, she'll sign whatever we put in front of her. He was wrong. 3 miles down a logging road that barely deserved the name, past cattails and black water and a stand of dead cypress trees, there was a structure, not a house, not quite, but something was inside it. Something Raymond Calloway had spent 11 years building in silence. Every person in that county courthouse watched Douglas Merritt understand what it was worth, out loud, in front of witnesses, with no road left to take. What happened to Clara Calloway after 40 years, after a hand-drawn map, after a logging road through a Kentucky swamp in November, is exactly why I open every single letter I receive. Stay with me. On the morning of Tuesday, November 4th, in the town of Callaway Crossing, Kentucky, Clara Calloway sat in a straight-back chair in the offices of Merritt and Associates and listened to her husband's name being read aloud by a man who had never once called her anything but Mrs. Calloway, and said it now the way you might say the name of someone you had already decided did not matter. Raymond had been gone 11 days. 11 days. And the chair beside her was empty, and the attorney's voice kept moving through the document like water through a drain, and she sat very still and listened to 40 years disappear. The house on Birchwood Lane, to Raymond's daughter, Celeste, from his first marriage. The savings accounts, totaling $214,000, split equally between Celeste and her brother Thomas. The lake property in Letcher County to Thomas outright. And then the pause. The particular kind of pause that tells you what comes next will require you to keep your face very still. Douglas Merritt looked up from the document. He was 51, fit in the way of men who hire trainers and eat carefully and understand that appearance is a form of power. He had married Celeste 7 years ago, and in that 7 years he had spoken to Claire approximately 40 times and had looked at her, truly looked at her, fewer than 5. He said, there is one remaining asset, a parcel of land, approximately 11 acres in the Canoe Creek bottomland south of Harlan County. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Your husband designated this property to you specifically. There's a structure on it. It's been assessed. He paused again. The assessed value is $4,200. He said it the way you set something small and broken on a table in front of someone and let them understand it is all they are going to get. There are some papers here for you to consider regarding the estate as a whole, a release. If you sign it today, we can have everything settled before the end of the month. Clara did not look at the papers. She looked at the folded map. Raymond's handwriting was on it. She could see it from across the table, the particular way he drew his R's, a habit she had known for 4 decades. She picked up the map and held it in both hands and did not say anything for a long moment. And Douglas Merritt recrossed his legs and checked something on the phone that he then placed face down on the table because he was a man who understood the performance of patience. Then Clara said, I'll need some time. Douglas smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that contains no warmth whatsoever but has learned to approximate it. Of course, take the week. I'll have someone follow up. He said it the way you say, take the week to someone you expect to have finished deciding before Thursday. She folded the map carefully and put it inside her coat. She stood. She said thank you to no one in particular and walked out into the November air and stood on the sidewalk outside Merritt and Associates on Court Street in Callaway Crossing. And the cold came in off the mountains and the bare trees moved in it, and she stood there holding the front of her coat closed with one hand and Raymond's map pressed against her chest beneath it. And she did not cry. She had not cried in 11 days. She was not sure she remembered how. What she knew was this: Raymond had drawn that map himself. He had written on it. He had left it specifically to her. In 40 years of marriage, Raymond Callaway had not done a single careless thing. He had not done a single thing without reason. And the man in that office, the man who spoke to her like she was a piece of furniture that happened to be taking up space near a table, did not know that. And she did not intend to tell him. She had nowhere to be. The house on Birchwood Lane was no longer hers after the 1st of December per the will, a provision Douglas had mentioned quickly and quietly at the end. The way you mention a thing you hope will be forgotten. She had 6 weeks. She stood on the sidewalk and she thought about Raymond's handwriting on that map, and she thought about the particular way he had always done things. The slow way, the careful way, the way that other people sometimes mistook for simple stubbornness. And she unfolded the map just slightly and looked at the word he had written at the bottom in his careful block letters. He had written, "For Vera, look inside." She folded it back. She had known Raymond Callaway for 43 years. She had known him before the children from his first marriage, before Celeste and Thomas, before the house on Birchwood Lane and the lake property and the savings accounts that were now being divided by people who had spent very little time considering what she had contributed to their accumulation. She had taught school for 22 of those years. She had kept the books for Raymond's hardware business for 16. She had cooked and cleaned and driven and planned and managed and attended and remembered, and she had done it with a quietness that people had sometimes mistaken for smallness, and she had never once corrected them, because Raymond knew, and that had been enough. It would have to still be enough. She drove herself home, to the house that was still technically hers for 6 more weeks, and she sat at the kitchen table with the map spread open in front of her, and she looked at it for a long time. It was hand-drawn in Raymond's careful style, with distances marked in his small, precise numbers, and a compass rose drawn in the corner the way he always drew them, slightly off-center, a habit from the years he had surveyed land in his 20s. The structure was marked with a small square. The road to it was marked with a dotted line. And beside the small square he had written one more thing, a thing she had not seen until now in letters smaller than the rest. "I built this for you. You will understand when you see it. Trust me one more time." She sat with that for a long time. She did not call Celeste. She did not call Thomas. She did not call Douglas Merritt's office to say she would be signing anything. She sat in Raymond's kitchen in Raymond's chair, and she held his map and she thought, all right, one more time. The following morning, she called the one person in Callaway Crossing who had known Raymond longer than she had, a woman named June Farley, who had lived 3 houses down from Raymond's childhood home and who had, for reasons neither of them had ever fully explained, kept a key to every property Raymond had ever owned, a habit Raymond had described as June's particular form of love. June was 77, drove a 20-year-old pickup truck with a cracked passenger mirror, and had exactly 0 patience for ceremony. Clara said, "June, Raymond left me a piece of swampland in Harlan County." June said, "I know." There was a pause. "You know," Clara said. "He told me about it," June said. "3 years ago, he said you called me when they gave you the map." A beat. "Did Douglas Merritt try to get you to sign something?" "The same day." "Of course he did." June's voice carried a particular flatness that Clara had always found deeply comforting. "Don't sign a thing, Clara, not one thing. I'll come over tomorrow and we'll drive down there together." Clara looked at the map. She looked at Raymond's small, careful letters. "Trust me one more time." "All right," she said. But that night, alone in the house that would stop being hers in 6 weeks, the silence pressed in around her with a weight she had not expected, and she sat with Raymond's map in both hands and stared at the compass rose he had drawn slightly off-center. And for the first time in 11 days, she felt the full size of what she had lost. And her hands shook so badly she had to set the map down on the table and press both palms flat against the wood to make them stop. She sat like that for a long time. The phone did not ring. The house was very still. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare trees on Birchwood Lane, and the sound of it was like something trying to get in, and Clara sat with her palms flat on the kitchen table and did not let herself think about what happened if the map led nowhere. Not yet. Not tonight. She would go. She would see. And if Raymond had left her nothing but a shack in a swamp, she would deal with that on the other side of knowing. She picked the map back up. She was going anyway. They left on a Thursday morning, November 6th, June's old pickup rattling through the mountain road south of Callaway Crossing toward Harlan County, the heater working adequately on the driver's side and not at all on the passenger side, which June had addressed by handing Clara a wool blanket without comment before they pulled out of the driveway. The sky was low and gray and the trees were stripped down to their architecture. Clara had the map in her lap. She had not slept well. She had, in fact, barely slept at all. June drove with the particular economy of someone who has been driving these roads for 50 years and has stopped finding anything about them remarkable. She had a thermos of coffee wedged between the seat and the center console. She had said very little since they left, which was one of the things Clara had always valued most about her. June Farley was a woman who understood that some mornings did not require filling. "How long did you know?" Clara asked, somewhere past the county line. "Know about the property since he bought it." June glanced at the road. "That was going on 12 years ago now. He came to me about it first. Said he'd found something and he needed someone who knew how to keep a quiet thing quiet." She took a long pull from the thermos. "I told him I'd been doing that since 1974 and I was unlikely to change. He never told me." "No." June's voice was even. "He said he wanted to finish it first. He said he'd been starting things for other people his whole life, and he wanted to finish one thing for you before—" She stopped. She cleared her throat. "Before he ran out of time, his words." Clara looked out the window at the gray hills moving past. She did not say anything. There was a pressure behind her eyes that she was not prepared to address on a 2-lane mountain road with 60 miles still to go. "Was he out there often?" she asked finally. "Every few weeks for a while, then more. The last 2 years, quite a lot." June said it simply, without apology. "He drove himself, even last winter when he probably shouldn't have." Clara thought about all the Saturdays Raymond had said he was going to check on the hardware store inventory. All the Sunday afternoons when he had been quiet in a particular way, a thinking way, the way he got when something was coming together in his mind. She had known the look. She had not known the reason. She had trusted him. The way you trust someone after 40 years, the way trust becomes less an act of faith and more just a condition of the air you breathe. And she had not asked, because she had known he would tell her when it was time. He had just run out of time slightly before she expected. The logging road appeared exactly where the map said it would, marked by a rusted gate that had been left open and a reflector post that had been there long enough to grow partially into the bark of the tree beside it. June turned down it without slowing. The road was rougher than the map had made it seem. Or perhaps the map had made it seem rougher and she had not believed it. And the truck moved carefully through wet gravel and old ruts and stands of bare-limbed trees that pressed close on both sides. The swamp appeared in pieces. First the smell of it, the cold mineral dark smell of still water in November, then the gleam of it through the trees, then the sound of the truck tires moving through a shallow stretch where the road dipped into a few inches of standing water. "Almost there," June said. And then they came around a bend in the road and Clara saw it. It was not what she had expected. It was not exactly a shack. It was low and wide, built from a combination of rough-cut timber and what appeared to be salvaged barn wood, and it sat on a slightly elevated piece of ground above the waterline with a narrow porch across the front. And behind it, connected by a covered walkway, was a second larger structure, workshop-sized with a metal roof that had oxidized to a dull rust orange. The main structure had windows, real windows, set into the walls with care. The porch had a railing. Someone had built a small stone path from the road to the porch steps. Raymond had built this. Clara did not move for a long moment. She sat in the truck with the blanket in her lap and the map she no longer needed, and she looked at the low, careful building in the swamp, and she thought, he made this. He made this, and he never said a word, and he left it for me. And now I am here. June said nothing. She had the particular wisdom to know when someone needed a moment to stay inside a feeling before they were required to move through it. Clara opened the truck door. The cold came in immediately, the wet cold of the bottomland, sharper than the mountain cold above. She walked the stone path slowly. The wood of the porch steps was solid under her feet, treated, maintained. He had been coming here recently enough to keep it up. The front door had a padlock on it. She reached into her coat pocket for the key the attorney's office had given her as part of the property transfer, a small key on a plain ring, and she fitted it to the lock, and it turned on the second try. Inside was one main room and a smaller room behind it. There was a wood stove. There were built-in shelves along 3 walls. There was a wide wooden workbench under the front windows, and on the shelves, she stopped. She stood in the doorway of Raymond's building and she looked at the shelves. They were not empty. They were the opposite of empty. They held things. Dozens of things. She could not take them in all at once. Her eyes kept moving and stopping and moving again. June appeared at her shoulder and looked at the room and made a sound that was not quite a word. June, Clara said, what did he build? I think, June said carefully, that you need to open a few of those before you make any judgments about what they are. She could not have said in that first moment what all of it was. She could see shapes. She could see sizes. She could see that the things on the shelves had been arranged with the particular attention of someone who understood what he was arranging. There were objects wrapped in cloth. There were boxes with lids. There were things that needed dusting and things that were pristinely, deliberately clean. There were frames. There was something large against the back wall covered in a canvas drop cloth. Whatever Raymond had been doing out here in this building, in this swamp, for 11 years, he had been doing it with extraordinary intention. She walked to the nearest shelf and picked up the first object that was not wrapped, a thing that had been sitting in plain view, slightly larger than a hardback book, dark wood carved on all 4 sides. She turned it over in her hands. She had seen things like this before. In a museum in Lexington she and Raymond had visited 20 years ago, in a case with a sign that she now could not remember but which had conveyed clearly that what was inside the case was not the kind of thing you handle without gloves. Her hands were not in gloves. She set it down very carefully. June, she said, how often did Raymond drive down here? More than you knew, June said. Less than he wanted to. She turned around and looked at the whole room again, slowly this time, trying to take an inventory. There were more objects on those shelves than she could count in a glance. Some were old, some were clearly very old. And some of them, she was not an expert. She had never claimed to be, but she had 40 years of Saturday estate sales and county fairs, and the particular education of a woman who pays attention. Some of them did not look like things that belonged in a swamp. That was when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Douglas Merritt. She let it ring. She was going to need to understand what was on these shelves before she spoke to Douglas Merritt again. She was going to need to understand it very well. She looked at June. June was watching her with an expression that contained something Clara had not seen directed at her in quite some time. A focused, serious respect. There's more, June said. The back building. He told me the back building was the point of all of it. She paused. He said that was where he put the important ones. Clara looked at the door that led to the covered walkway and the larger structure behind the main room. She looked at the shelves around her, dozens of objects she had not yet touched, the large canvas-covered shape against the back wall, the careful arrangement of things Raymond had spent 11 years collecting. She had not yet opened the back building. The following morning, Douglas Merritt drove down that logging road himself. She had not answered his call, and he had left a message that was professional in its surface and something else entirely underneath. Something that she recognized as a man recalculating. He arrived at 9:15 in a car that was not built for a logging road, in shoes that were not built for wet gravel. He walked the stone path with the expression of someone who had expected to feel contempt and was finding it harder than anticipated. He stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the shelves, and his expression shifted once before he got it back under control. He said, "Clara, this property is legally yours, no question. But I want you to understand that you're going to need to manage it carefully. Taxes on bottom land like this, maintenance, the structure alone." He looked around the room with professional assessment and personal calculation running simultaneously behind his eyes. There are people who specialize in handling situations like this, simplifying estates. I know several. It might be worth a conversation before you make any decisions about what to do with. He gestured at the shelves. All of this. She looked at him. She said, "What would you say this is worth?" He smiled the practiced smile. "Well, that's hard to say without a proper assessment. I'd really need a professional opinion before." "Take a guess," she said. He looked at the shelves. His eyes went to the carved wooden object she had picked up yesterday, to 3 or 4 of the other pieces she had since unwrapped. He said, "Sentimental value, probably. Old things, estate sale material. I wouldn't get your hopes up." June, who was standing behind Clara and had been silent, made a sound. Douglas Merritt looked at June and then back at Clara. "I do think it's worth having someone come look. One of my contacts at Ashford Property Group." "Thank you," Clara said. "I'll be in touch." He stood there for another moment, recalculating again. And then he said something that every person in that room would remember for a long time. He said, "Clara, I say this with respect. You don't have the resources to manage this kind of situation on your own. You need someone who understands what they're looking at." He said it quietly and evenly, and with the absolute conviction of a man who has never once doubted his own judgment about what a woman in her 70s is capable of. "Raymond left you something complicated. Let us help you simplify it." June took one step back as if distancing herself from the words. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'll call you." He left. The logging road took his car around the bend and out of sight, and June and Clara stood on the porch and listened to the swamp come back to its own sounds. The birds, the water moving, the particular quiet of a place that had been keeping a secret for 11 years. "He doesn't know," June said. "No," said Clara, "he doesn't." She looked at the door to the covered walkway, the back building, where Raymond had said he'd put the important ones. She had not opened it yet. She had been saving it. She was not sure for what exactly. For the right moment, for the right light, for some readiness she had not yet reached. She pulled the second key from her coat pocket, the one that had been inside the padlock of the main building when she'd opened it, hanging on the inside of the lock on a strip of leather with a small handwritten tag attached in Raymond's writing that said, "For the other door, when you're ready." She held it in her closed hand. She was not quite ready yet, but she would be by morning. She opened the back building on a Friday, November 7th, just after 7 in the morning, in a light that was barely light, the swamp still half dark and the mist sitting on the water like something that had nowhere better to be. She had slept in the main room, on a cot she had found folded behind the wood stove, which she now understood Raymond had kept there for himself. And she had woken before dawn and lain in the dark, listening to the building settle and the water move and the particular silence of a place that had been holding something for a long time. And she had known she was ready. The walkway between the buildings was covered with a corrugated metal roof on wooden posts, and her feet were loud on it in the morning quiet. The back building's door had a separate padlock, heavier than the first. She fitted the key. It turned smoothly, which meant it had been used recently, which meant Raymond had been here recently. And she had to stop for a moment with the key still in the lock and press her other hand against the cold metal of the door and just breathe. Because Raymond had been here, had stood here, had opened this door and closed it and driven home to Birchwood Lane and said nothing. And now he was gone. She opened the door. The smell came first, dry and faintly sweet, like paper kept in a dark drawer for 30 years, like something preserved on purpose, like the past made physical and held still. She found the light switch. The overhead lights came on. The back building was larger than the main room. It had been built with purpose and fitted out with the same quiet care as everything else here. Wooden shelving, floor to ceiling along 2 walls, a central work table, temperature controls that she could see on one wall and only now understood meant Raymond had installed climate control in a building in a swamp in Harlan County, Kentucky, because what he was keeping here required it. The shelves were full, orderly, categorized, labeled in his small, precise hand. The objects here were different from the ones in the main room, larger and more deliberately housed, each one in a box or case or protective wrapping that had clearly been researched and selected. She could see on the labels categories she could not yet fully parse, dates, place names, descriptors in language she did not know. Against the far wall, on a dedicated section of shelving that was slightly different from the rest, built lower and with a different kind of backing, were 12 framed pieces. Not frames for paintings, frames for documents. She walked toward them. She stood in front of them for a long time. She knew, without being able to fully say why she knew, that what she was looking at was important. The documents were old, visibly, unmistakably old, and they had been housed in archival frames with UV protective glass, which meant Raymond had known enough to do it right, and the labels beneath each one were in his writing, with dates and provenance notes that meant nothing specific to her but conveyed, in their tone, that he had known exactly what he had. Her phone was in her coat pocket. She took it out and she called June. June said, "Are you in the back building?" "Yes." "I'll call Thomas Brenly," June said. "He's the one you want." She had not heard that name in 20 years. Thomas Brenly had taught American art history at the University of Kentucky for 36 years. He had retired to a house outside Berea and had, she now recalled, been a friend of Raymond's from before Clara had known either of them, from the years Raymond had surveyed land all over eastern Kentucky and had sometimes wandered into old farmhouses and old estate sales and had known enough even then to recognize something worth noticing. Thomas Brenly arrived the following morning, Saturday the 8th. He was 74, lean and white-haired, with the hands of someone who had spent his life handling things that required care. He drove himself from Berea, which was a 2-hour drive, and he arrived at 9 in the morning with a field bag over his shoulder and a set of white cotton gloves in the outer pocket. And when June introduced him to Clara, he took her hand in both of his and said, "June tells me Raymond built himself a collection out here." "He did," Clara said. "I suspected he might be doing something like this," Brenly said. "He called me 4 years ago to ask about provenance documentation. I didn't ask for details. Raymond never liked to say a thing before it was finished." He looked toward the buildings. "Can I see it?" She showed him the main room first. He moved through it slowly, picking up nothing, touching nothing, leaning close to look and then straightening and moving on. He made sounds, small sounds, professional sounds, the sounds of a man who is adjusting his expectations upward. He spent 15 minutes in the main room. Then she opened the door to the walkway. He walked into the back building. He stopped almost immediately. He looked at the shelves on the left wall for a long time without speaking. Then he walked to the framed documents and stood in front of them. And he stood there for what felt like a long time, and Clara stood behind him and waited, and June stood in the doorway and said nothing. Thomas Brenly turned around. He looked at Clara. His expression was not the expression she had expected. It was the expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life preparing for a moment, who has arrived at that moment and who has taken a breath. He said, "Clara, do you know what Raymond was collecting?" "Old things," she said. "Yes," he said. "Very old things. Very specific old things." He looked back at the shelves. What Raymond was collecting, the main room, the documented pieces in here, is Kentucky folk art and Appalachian craft, specifically pieces from the late 18th century through the early 20th. Documented, provenance-researched pieces. He paused. "Do you know what the market for that is at the moment?" She did not. He told her. She sat down on the bench along the center work table because her legs had decided, apparently, that standing was no longer reasonable. "That's for the main collection," he said carefully. "The documented pieces, the framed items on that wall are a separate matter. Those are—" He stopped. He took a breath. "Those are something that doesn't come to light very often. Those would need to go through proper appraisal and authentication. But if they are what I believe they are, and I have been doing this for 40 years, and I believe they are exactly what they appear to be, then what you are looking at on that wall is not a supplementary part of the collection." He looked at her. "It is the reason the collection exists." "What do you mean?" "I mean Raymond did not collect casually. He was building toward something. That wall is what he was building toward." He looked at the framed documents. He was very patient. He was very careful. He was right about what he found. He looked back at her. He was protecting something. He put it here because he understood it needed to be protected, and he needed to put it somewhere that would only be found by you. She thought about Douglas Merritt. She thought about the way he had stood in the doorway of the main room and said, "Sentimental value, probably. Old things. Estate sale material." She thought about what he had said to her face. "You don't have the resources to manage this kind of situation on your own." "What does authenticated appraisal look like?" she asked. "What do I need to do?" Brenly sat down across from her. "You need a certified appraiser. Not from around here. From Louisville or Lexington, someone who specializes. I know who to call. I can call today." He looked at her steadily. "But I want to tell you one thing first, and I want to say it clearly." She waited. "Do not sign anything," he said. "Do not let anyone from that attorney's office near this property until you have documentation in hand. Do you understand?" She thought about the release form, the one Douglas Merritt had put in front of her the same afternoon they'd read the will. "Sign today," he had said. "We can have everything settled by the end of the month." Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Douglas Merritt again. She set the phone face down on the work table. "I understand," she said. Brenly called his contact that afternoon, a woman from Lexington, a certified appraiser with 30 years of experience in American antiques and folk art. She would come Tuesday. She was very clear that she would need to see everything. That night, after Brenly had gone and June had gone home to feed her dogs, and Clara was alone in Raymond's main room with the wood stove burning low, she sat on the cot with one of the objects from the main room in her hands. Not an important one, not a documented one, just a small carved bird Raymond had set on the lowest shelf near the door. The kind of thing you might put somewhere because you wanted it to be the first thing you saw when you came in. And she turned it over and over in her hands, and she thought about everything she did not know about her husband. Everything she had not known was happening while she was at home on Birchwood Lane. Everything that had been building, quietly, in a swamp, while she was living an ordinary life that she had believed was the whole of things. She set the bird down. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands. Because here is what she was afraid of, and here is where she needed to say it aloud, even to no one, even to a room that held nothing but Raymond's things and the sound of the swamp outside. She was afraid that she had missed it. She was afraid that Raymond had been trying to tell her something for years. Through the Saturdays he went away, through the quiet and careful way he looked at old things, through the particular way he had held her hand last spring when he had known the doctors had told him then that time was shortening, and she had been too busy managing the house and the small emergencies of ordinary life to hear it. She was afraid that this whole place, this entire 11-year quiet project of love and protection had happened right alongside her, and she had not known to look. She was afraid that a life beside a person was not the same as fully knowing them, and that she had learned this too late to do anything with the knowledge. She was afraid that she had been given something extraordinary, and that she did not deserve it, because she had not been paying the right kind of attention. She said this out loud, not carefully, not tidily. She said it to the small carved bird on the shelf, and to the wood stove, and to the walls Raymond had built around her, and her voice was unsteady and the room was very quiet, and she was, for the first time since the attorney's office, honestly frightened. Not of Douglas Merritt, not of the release form, not of the 6 weeks left on Birchwood Lane, but of the size of what had been given to her and the question of whether she was the person it had been meant for. She sat like that for a long time. The wood stove popped. The swamp moved in the dark outside. She had come a long way from Callaway Crossing, and she was 71 years old, and her husband had been building her a secret for 11 years, and now it was hers, and she was sitting on a cot in the dark being afraid of it, which was not a useful thing to be, and which Raymond, she was quite certain, had not intended. She picked up the carved bird. She held it in both hands. She thought about the compass rose Raymond had always drawn slightly off-center. She thought about how she had asked him once years ago why he always drew it that way, and he had said, "Because true north is never exactly where you expect it to be. You have to look for it." She had not understood then. She thought she might understand now. She set the bird down carefully. She lay down on the cot and pulled the blanket over herself, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought, all right, I was not paying the wrong kind of attention. I was paying the only kind I knew how to pay. And Raymond knew that. And he built this anyway, because he trusted me to find my way here. She closed her eyes. By morning, she was steadier. By morning, she had decided 3 things. She was not signing the release. She was not speaking to Douglas Merritt again without documentation in hand. And she was going to understand completely and fully exactly what Raymond had left her before she said a single word to anyone who had given her a map to a swamp and thought that was the end of the story. She did not know yet what Tuesday's appraiser was going to say, but she knew that Thomas Brenly had looked at the wall of framed documents and had used the phrase "doesn't come to light" very often. And she knew that Raymond had spent 11 years making sure it came to light only for her. The certified appraiser's name was Catherine Hollis. She arrived on Tuesday, November 11th at 8 in the morning in a gray SUV with 3 cases of equipment and the focused, unhurried energy of someone who has spent 30 years doing exactly this work and has no patience for anything that is not directly relevant to it. She was 62 with close-cut silver hair and the kind of precise, unadorned handshake that tells you immediately where you stand. Thomas Brenly met her at the logging road and walked her in. Clara stood on the porch and watched them come. Catherine Hollis spent the first 2 hours in the back building alone. Clara and June and Brenly sat in the main room and spoke very little. At one point, June refilled the wood stove. At one point, Clara walked to the window and looked at the swamp and thought about nothing particular. At one point, Brenly said quietly, "She is very good at her job. Whatever she tells you, it will be accurate." At 11:15, Catherine Hollis came out of the back building and stood in the doorway of the covered walkway and looked at Clara. She said, "Mrs. Callaway, I need to talk to you." They sat at the central work table. Brenly and June sat to the side. Catherine Hollis opened her notebook and set it flat on the table and folded her hands on top of it and looked at Clara with an expression that was entirely professional and contained underneath the professionalism something Clara could not quite name, which she would later decide was a kind of wonder. Your husband had an exceptional eye, she said. The main collection, the folk art and craft objects in the front room, represents 41 authenticated pieces. The market value for the collection as a unit, based on current comparable sales, is between $340,000 and $410,000. She paused to let that settle. That is the main collection. June made a sound. The framed documents, Catherine Hollis continued, are a different category. They are, and I am being careful with my language here because authentication at this level requires verification I cannot single-handedly provide. They appear to be 12 original land grants from the early 19th century relating to Appalachian Kentucky. 3 of them bear signatures of historical significance that would, if authenticated by the proper institutional body, place them outside the private collector market entirely and into the category of institutional acquisition. Clara said, "What does that mean?" "It means that museums and universities buy them," Brenly said quietly. "The preliminary valuation for the documents," Catherine Hollis said, "pending full authentication, is between $1.2 and $1.9 million. I want to emphasize preliminary. But I also want to be clear that my preliminary valuation in cases like this has historically been conservative." She looked at Clara. "Whoever told you this property was worth $4,000 either did not come to this building or they did come to this building and they understood very quickly that they needed you to sign something before you found out what was here." The room was very quiet. Clara thought about Douglas Merritt standing in the doorway of the main room, his eyes going to the shelves, his expression shifting once before he got it back under control. She thought about the practiced smile. She thought about, "I do think it's worth having someone come look." She thought about the release form, sitting unsigned on the kitchen table at Birchwood Lane. She said, "He came here before I did." "Yes," said Catherine Hollis. "I thought that might be the case." That afternoon, Clara called an attorney, not Douglas Merritt, a property attorney in Harlan County named Martin Oakes, who had, as his associate mentioned when Clara called, a specific background in estate disputes and Appalachian land title, and who, when June Farley's name came up as a reference, said he would come himself. Martin Oakes was Clara's 5th named person in this story, and he was the one who made the next part possible. He arrived Wednesday morning, reviewed the documentation Brenly and Hollis had assembled, examined the release form Clara had never signed, and said with the professional quiet of a man who has seen a great many things, "This is straightforward. This property was always solely yours. The release was not legally required for any part of the estate settlement. Its only function would have been to prevent you from bringing certain claims." He paused. "What claims?" Clara asked. "Against the estate, for contribution. 40 years of managing the books of a hardware business is documented. Your husband documented it carefully." He looked at her steadily. "He also left a letter with me, filed 18 months ago. He anticipated this. He wanted to make sure you had what you needed to protect yourself." She sat very still. "He wrote you a letter," Oakes said. "He asked me to give it to you when you came. He said, and I am quoting, 'She'll come when she's ready, and she'll have June with her, and she will not have signed anything.'" He smiled briefly. He was right. She took the letter. She did not open it yet. She would open it tonight, alone, with the wood stove, in the building Raymond had made for her. The formal proceedings were scheduled for December 8th in the Harlan County Courthouse. Douglas Merritt had been notified. He arrived with Celeste Thomas and a property attorney of his own, a man from Lexington who had, in Oakes's words, a very good reputation and a very clear picture of what he was now dealing with. The courthouse gallery held more people than Clara had expected, which she later attributed to June Farley's understanding of how information travels in small counties. Clara sat at the table with Martin Oakes and Catherine Hollis's full authentication report, which had come back 3 days prior with every figure at the high end of the preliminary range and one figure, for the most significant of the land grant documents, $22,000 above it. Douglas Merritt came to her table before the proceedings began. He was composed. He was in a very good suit. He stood across from her and he looked at the authentication documents and he said, in a voice that was lower than usual but carried in the quiet room and was heard by Martin Oakes and by Catherine Hollis and by June Farley, who was sitting in the second row of the gallery, exactly this. Clara, I want you to understand, whatever these documents say, that woman you've been for 40 years, standing behind a man who never put your name on a single thing, that's all this is, paper. It doesn't change what you were. The room went very still. One of the witnesses in the gallery, a woman Clara did not know, looked at her hands. Martin Oakes went still in the way of a professional who is carefully not reacting. June Farley in the second row straightened in her chair with the particular stillness of someone choosing not to speak. Clara looked at Douglas Merritt. She held the moment for a breath. She let him stand in what he had just said. Then she said, "His name is on everything now." She said it quietly. She said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and only needs to be said aloud once. Douglas Merritt stood there. He did not have a response that would help him. His attorney to his left looked at the table. The proceedings took 4 hours. The authenticated collection was documented, the estate claims were filed, the land grant documents were formally transferred to Clara's sole ownership pending final institutional acquisition discussions. The total documented value of the Canoe Creek property and its contents, as entered into the record by Catherine Hollis, was $2,163,400. At various points during the reading of this figure, different members of the gallery made sounds. Martin Oakes did not make a sound. June Farley in the second row folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. Celeste and Thomas left without speaking to Clara. Douglas Merritt left without speaking to anyone. She watched him go from the courthouse steps, his good shoes on the December pavement, his car in the lot, his back to her, and she thought about Raymond's building in the swamp, and the temperature controls he had installed, and the framed documents on the low shelf with the archival glass. And she thought, he knew. He always knew. He built this for exactly this. That evening, alone in the back building with the work table lamp on and Raymond's letter open in front of her, she read it. She read it twice. She sat for a long time after he had written, "I know this is not how I wanted to give it to you. I wanted to be there. I wanted to see your face when you understood what it was. I started collecting because I found that first piece in a farmhouse outside Harlan in 1984. And I knew it was something and I kept it in the truck for 6 months because I didn't know what else to do with it. Then I kept finding more. Then it got serious. Then I found the land grants and I understood what I was doing. I was building something that couldn't be taken. I was building something with your name on it. Not my name, not the children's names, yours. I should have told you sooner. I didn't because I wanted to finish it first and I ran out of finishing time and I am sorry for that. But I trust you to know what to do with it. You always knew what to do with things. I just wasn't always smart enough to tell you so." She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she did one more thing. She took out her phone and she called a woman named Frances Akers, who was 69 years old, who had written to the Callaway Crossing Courier the previous spring about being left a single piece of property in a contested estate and not having the resources to pursue it. Clara had read the letter at the time and thought about it once and then put it aside. She thought about it now. Frances answered on the third ring. Clara said, "This is Clara Callaway. I read your letter in the Courier. I think you need an attorney named Martin Oakes, and I would like to pay his initial retainer." There was a silence. Frances Akers said, I don't know why you'd do that." Clara looked at the framed documents on the low wall. She looked at the lamp on the work table. She thought about Raymond drawing his compass roses slightly off-center. "Because someone should have done it sooner," she said, "and we're going to start now." She established in January a small fund through Martin Oakes's office for women in contested estate situations in eastern Kentucky. It was named the Canoe Creek Fund, after the bottomland where Raymond had spent 11 years building her something that could not be taken. The first 3 women it helped had their cases resolved by the following spring. June Farley was on the fund's advisory board. Catherine Hollis donated her initial assessment fees back to it. Thomas Brinley taught a free seminar on recognizing the value in inherited objects, held at the Berea Library on the last Saturday of every month. And Clara Calloway, who had been handed a map to a swamp and told it was all she was getting, kept the carved bird from the lowest shelf of the front room, the small one Raymond had placed by the door so it would be the first thing he saw when he came in. She kept it on her kitchen windowsill in the new house she rented in Calloway Crossing, on the side where the morning light came in. She looked at it every day. She thought it was the best thing in the collection. What stayed with me about Clara's letter, what I keep coming back to, is that Raymond didn't just leave her something valuable. He left her the one thing no one could contest, no one could undervalue, no one could hand her like spare change on a conference table. He left her the truth about what she had always been worth. Douglas Merritt said her name was on nothing. Raymond spent 11 years making sure it was on everything. Every letter I receive reminds me of the same thing. The people the world gives up on are often the ones who were worth the most all along. If someone has ever handed you a map to a swamp and called it your inheritance, I want to hear from you. Leave it in the comments. And if this story found someone who needed it today, please share it. I'll see you in the next letter.